Callie Shanafelt, thanks very much for coming on to Talk Beliefs all the way from California. We're going to be talking about your documentary, The Fountain, in a minute, which investigates the Fountain the World cult and its ultimate destruction at the hands of a suicide bomber. But first, a little bit of background about yourself. Before you took up filmmaking, you were a reporter on a local radio station, is that right?
Yeah, I grew up in the Seattle area, and before moving to California, I had a community radio, weekly radio show about social justice issues for about 8 years.
And you obviously since very much into documentary making and filmmaking.
Yeah, I would still consider myself a journalist, but I moved to the Bay Area to go to the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley and focus on their documentary program to kind of switch from audio to video.
Well, The Fountain is a very personal story for you because it deals with your family and their involvement in a cult back in the 40s and the 50s. It follows your father and your uncle as they try to piece together why their parents, your grandparents, got caught on this really rather bizarre cult. So before we go any deeper into the story and what happened with your family, let's just have a look at the trailer.
These are my grandparents. They believed this guy was the second coming of Christ. So they joined the Wisdom, Knowledge, Faith, and Love Fountain of the World cult. They lived communally, went barefoot, and pledged not to cut their hair in the era of crew cuts and McCarthy. But it all ended when they were killed in a bombing at the cult in 1958. My dad told me where he grew up when I was a little girl, but he couldn't remember much.
You went to public school?
Yeah.
What was that like?
I'm going to school. I mean, I don't know what do you mean, what was it like?
Well, what was it like to be like, I mean, how do people react to you because you were in a cult?
I spent a year with my dad and his brother retracing their childhood and trying to understand my grandparents.
So now this rock right here is the rock where they did the Easter pageant every year.
Callie, the cult was called the Wisdom, Knowledge, Faith, and Love Fountain of the World, though most people just call it The Fountain. Its leader, as we saw in the trailer there, was a man called Krishna Venta. So can you talk a little bit about Krishna Venta and who this guy thought he was?
So he said that he was the second coming of Christ or the Messiah, and my grandparents believed him. Spoiler alert, probably wasn't. But he also at other times had said he was a doctor. I think he had charges against him at one point for practicing medicine without a license. He did various kind of cons at different points in his life, but he settled on Krishna Venta and being called, they called him the Master and claiming that he was a Messiah.
Wow.
But his original name was Francis Pinkovic.
Ah, so your father spent his early years in that cult because his own parents had joined, but your dad pretty much sort of filed it away in his life until you decided to make this film. So what made you decide to tell this story, and what was your dad's first reaction to your idea?
Well, as you mentioned, the cult was bombed when my dad was 12, and he survived the bombing. But that was a really traumatic experience for him, and so he told me there was a moment where he just said, "I'm going to forget this. I'm just going to put this away." And he just his aunt and uncle came and took him from the fountain and took him up to Seattle, and he just tried to create a normal life for himself. And so they told me about my dad's childhood when I was very young, but I, as a future journalist, always had lots of questions for him, but he never really had many answers. And eventually I kind of gave up on asking because I felt like he didn't really want to talk about it, although he tried to answer my questions. And so about 40 years after the bombing, he started to remember stuff, and he would kind of bring things up random times. And so then when, as I mentioned, I went to the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley, I was looking for a thesis project. And so I thought this might be a good excuse to get to ask my dad these questions that I'd kind of given up on asking. That's one of the best parts of being a journalist, is it kind of gives you the license to ask things you're afraid to ask otherwise. And so he was, when I first asked him to do it, he was basically very humble. I mean, he doesn't think he's important. So he was just like, well, if that's what you want to do, sure. And then my Uncle Dick is also, I asked him, I knew my dad wouldn't really have much information. He joined when they were 4, and when he was 4, and then his parents were killed when he was 12. And so, but my Uncle Dick was, I think, 8 years old when they joined. So he remembered more of their early life in Seattle before they joined. And then he was really being groomed to become the new leader in the cult. And
Wow.
so he remembers a lot and is very talkative. So I was really and he was, he's a wonderful man, and he was happy, and I think almost really ready to talk about that experience. And then it ended up being very cathartic for them, which I didn't really set out necessarily to do. I don't know why my dad chose not to have emotions about it, and I am a very emotional person, but I didn't mean to impose my emotions on him. That was, I wanted to just let him feel how he did about it, but it ended up surfacing a lot of things for him that both he and my Uncle Dick said they were really glad to get to deal with those things.
I mean, it is a very emotional film for those of us who are lucky to have seen it. I'm not going to give anything away, of course, but there is some very emotional parts in the film, especially towards the end. Now, there must have been a heck of a lot of research, Callie, that you had to do before making this film. So I'm curious to know what avenues that you went down and what kind of things that you uncovered.
Yeah, well, I did some like formal research, like I requested Krishna Venta's FBI file, and I requested to see if there was one for my grandparents, which there wasn't. And then there was this notebook that my relatives had collected of all the things that they had heard or gotten from the fountain over the years. So there were some like promotional brochures and newspaper articles and that kind of thing. And then also my grandmother's letters home and one letter from my grandfather. But that really gave a sense of what life was like. And I just savored reading those letters. I did not want to read the last one. I was sad when I got through them all. And so then I did, researched other newspaper articles and things like that from the time to see how it had been reported on.
It sounds like you found more than you could actually use.
Oh yeah, there's so much more that's not in the film. And I actually met some other, there's a wonderful man named Bill Appleton who wrote a section on the fountain for a history book about Simi Valley, which is where the fountain was located in Southern California. And so he was very generous with his research as well, and he let me come over to his house in LA and look through all his archives and interview him about interviews he had done with fountain members who had died. And then I also actually went to Ohio and met a former member of the fountain who stayed after the bombing and lived there for another couple decades.
So even though Krishna Venta had died, it sort of went on till about 1980 or something, is that right? The cult?
Yeah, I think that's about, she said, so they owned this big property in Box Canyon. That was a bunch of buildings and things. And we go and tour what it looks like now in the film. But they owned the property. And so the members, after the bombing, when you joined the fountain, you gave all your belongings and everything, and you gave up your shoes and you wore robes, and you know, so people had nothing when it fell apart. So my grandparents were kind of like second in command, and they lived in the leadership building, and that was the building that was bombed. So for the most part, the leaders were killed, but a couple leaders tried to keep things going, and then Charles Manson started his group not very far from there, and he came, and some of his people lived there for a time until, according to this woman, Sister Barbara, that I met in Ohio, they kicked them out because they could tell they were up to bad things.
Are you saying that that Manson perhaps got some ideas from
there are some
the
people
fountain?
who say that. There's a few quotes from him where he talks about Krishna Venta, I think. You know, I think the members of the family wore robes that were similar to like the fountain people wore, but I don't know. There's a lot of speculation about that connection.
Because you do get a lot of cult leaders who, when you go into the history, you see that they visited other cult leaders, you know, and then they start adopting things like, for instance, I think it's the leader of the founder of Scientology. You know, he hung around with Aleister Crowley and got some ideas from him, and the founder of Mormonism. He of course was involved with the Masons, and he got some ideas from them. So yeah, well, it's very typical.
Krishna Venta, I think, got some ideas from Mormons and from different practices.
Yeah, I noticed because I found a picture of the main sign that used to be outside, and it said the Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood, which is a very Mormon-esque thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, he kind of took from a lot of different theology and made his own, but they had a whole order of priests that came from that, I think.
Wow.
It was all, I mean, I read some of that along the way, but a lot of it didn't make sense to me, so I don't know that I could really say what he preached, but.
Arriving by air from Los Angeles, evangelist Krishna Venta, a self-styled new messiah, and his wife surprised Londoners on a spring morning in St. James's Park. Shoeless and garbed in powder blue robes, the gospeler, who says he lived nearly 2,000 years ago, is making a world tour to meet the common people. He claims 80,000 followers in America, a few in Britain, 2 million in the rest of the world. Having inquired after the king's health, Krishna and his 34-year-old wife, Ruth, the mother of his 4 children, walk to the Abraham Lincoln statue. There he salutes the Kentucky lawyer president, whose ideals of equality he endorses. From his £30 a week service flat in London, the evangelist will later travel to Paris, thence to Rome for an audience with the Pope.
Since you and your father and your uncle made this film, things must have changed for you in the family. Is just emotionally, or you said it felt very cathartic?
Yeah, I think it was. I'm very close to my dad anyway, but it certainly brought us closer, and it brought me and my uncle closer, and it made it like allowable in the family to talk about it, whereas it was something kind of everybody knew about, but you heard the story, like, you know, my mom told it to me, or, you know, it wasn't something that was talked about at family gatherings or whatever. And so I made a book of all my grandmother's letters, and gave it to all my cousins, and gave the fountain to my family and stuff, so that people would have that information too. So it's just kind of brought it to the surface, I think, and to a certain degree, like, released it. It's certainly not that it matters really for, I mean, I'm not the most important person in the story, but for me, it helped to really kind of understand my my dad and his childhood and the life he wanted to give me, and why he couldn't talk about it. You know, there was a point when I was working on the film, where I was just like, this is just so awful. Why did I do this to my dad? Why did I do this to my uncle? You know. But in the end, they both were glad that we did.
And you must feel that you have a stronger relationship with the both of them now because of this.
Yeah, I really do. I kind of have permission now to ask my dad all the questions I want. Even though
you could do an extended version of the film or a sequel or.
I know there's so much more to the story. Yeah.
Well, so you've got the fountain in the can now, so there must be other projects that you're involved in. We can see some of the, I think it looks like editing equipment behind you. So,
yeah,
what are you working on?
My primary job is that I'm a documentary editor. So I work right now at a wonderful production company in the Bay Area in Berkeley called the Sacred Land Film Project. And for the most part, we do documentaries that tell the stories of indigenous people fighting to protect their sacred sites around the world and in the US, but and mostly from environmental threats.
Excellent.
But sometimes from religious threats.
I'm sure that now people will want to see the complete film of the fountain. So it's on Vimeo for people to buy or rent. Is that right?
Yes. So there's it's Vimeo on demand. I think. Will you have the link? Should I give out the link or?
I'll include the link in the description below. But is it something that you can read off there? It's not too complex.
Okay. Yeah, it's not too hard. I think it's Vimeo on demand. No, Vimeo.com/on-demand/the fountain.
Right. Okay. Excellent. I'll have that pop up on the screen as well. So yeah, like I say, I will put links in the description below so people can find your work and follow you and keep up with what you're doing. So all that's left to say is, Callie, thank you very much indeed for coming on to Talk Beliefs.
Thank you for your work and your interest.